projector technology. Insurance costs, health insurance costs were a very big deal around 2003 and 2004. But government requirements, no big change. The change you see are financial and interest rates are high, and poor sales are high. But if you ask small businesses why is it that they are upset with the current economic situation, it's not because they're unusually worried about overregulation and overtaxation. It's because demand is low, aggregate demand is low, and because the interest rates at which they borrow are high. And if you have a theory of the Great Recession that attributes things happening in the minds of business proprietors as to government policy as the cause of a recession, if you say that it's these worries about government policy that have hit the minds of business entrepreneurs and that's the cause of the recession, when you ask business entrepreneurs what are you worried about, they should be worried. If they're not worried, the argument simply doesn't go through. Similarly, if businesses are genuinely worried about inflation due to government deficits, shouldn't we see this in financial markets? Shouldn't we see the price that you have to pay in financial markets for the trade which insures you against inflation over the next 10 years? Shouldn't that have a high price now? Instead of being a break-even trade at the about 2% per year expected inflation rate, which has been a break-even trade for most of the past decade or so, with the exception of the depths of the financial crisis. That there's no sign that businesses worried about inflation are taking any steps to insure themselves against it. And as to high interest rates in general, interest rates on safe U.S. Treasury securities continue at their extraordinarily low levels. So this, too, uncertainty simply fails to meet the plausibility test. That if people were uncertain and if that were causing the recession, we would expect to see signs of uncertainty in financial markets and surveys. We don't. It's entirely possible that uncertainty about future policy can generate a recession, but no signs it's generating this one. Similarly, it's entirely possible that overaccumulation of capital can generate a collapse of investment and a recession, but not this one, or if it did generate this one, it should have been over long ago. It's certainly possible that you can have a situation in which unemployment is high because of structural unemployment, because the workers you have aren't trained for the jobs that are profitable, but those are, again, situations in which there are high vacancies and rapidly rising wages, which is not now. And low marginal product workers, well, the horse example, that maybe if people become like horses, and then maybe you could say that changes in the economy might render a huge share of the potential labor force unemployable, just as the coming of electricity, the steam engine, and the internal combustion engine kind of rendered a great deal of the American horse population of the late 19th century unemployable as well. But people aren't horses. We don't have nearly as strong muscles as horses do, but each of us comes with one brain, one mouth, and two hands, and so we're much more flexible and adaptable than horses are. And we also can respond to incentives. So the argument that you can't redeploy America's low marginal product workers to other occupations than pounding nails in Nevada because their low marginal product is too low to make it worth their while to employ them in any other industry, that seems to me to fail as well, given the adaptability of the human being, especially because there simply aren't enough people working in construction in 2007 who are still here and are not working in construction to account for more than a very small fraction of the rise in unemployment that we see. Then there are the three views that say we're going to be agnostic about the sources of the recession, but we definitely don't need stimulative policies right now. The first, and this argument I hear most from John Cochran of the University of Chicago, is that further stimulative policies will set off a burst of inflation that will harm the economy in the long run, and it's cousin that further stimulative policies will raise interest rates and crowd out private investment and slow long-term government growth. On the internet this morning, once again, who was it? Somebody had a rant about how worries that Japanese reconstruction after the earthquake, about how that will push up interest rates and so diminish private investment and harm the global economy as the Japanese government borrows and spends a whole bunch of money to deal with the crisis caused by the earthquake and the tsunami. A rant about how that just doesn't apply because what we saw in the aftermath of the tsunami and the earthquake was not an increase but a decrease in the interest rates on Japanese and American government bonds, that people are more willing to buy them, right? Not less, that we're not crowding out private investment, we're crowding it in. If there were a genuine need to control inflation, well, you'd expect to see wages increase, or you'd expect to see the inflation rate implicit in government bond prices, this red line, rising rapidly, and no, we'd expect to see this blue line, which is the kind of real interest rate, rising rapidly, but it's not. That we see a situation in which an economy is approaching an inflation danger looks like, and once again, it doesn't look like this. And then we have those who say that banking and fiscal policy are simply unnecessary, who hang on to the old Milton Friedman monetary policy is all that's necessary, keep the stock of money growing smoothly, and everything will be fine. Here we have Nobel Prize winner Robert Lucas of the University of Chicago trashing Berkeley's own Christina Romer, rather unfairly, which annoys me, and which makes me think I should put up this slide fairly often, and point out that, well, you look at what Robert Lucas said in the late March conference at the Council on Foreign Relations during his question and answer session, and the first thing you recognize is that he hasn't really thought any of the issues through. That if you took Robert Lucas back to 1829 and put him in a room with John Stuart Mill and Jean-Baptiste Say, and had Lucas give his argument for why it was that increased government purchases or that bank rescues wouldn't help an economy in a financial crisis. I think that both Mill and Say would say, and this is supposed to be a macroeconomist, that these are issues that we have gotten straight now in 1829 about the relationship between the soundness of the banking sector and the level of overall employment. How come Bob Lucas in 2009 has not? Or other ones, say Eugene Fama of Chicago, often mentioned as a possible future Nobel Prize winner, saying on how fiscal policy has to be ineffective because whenever the government spends, it has to borrow, and whenever it borrows, it has to take money away from a single private individual who's also spending, and so whatever the government does to spend money has by definition got to decrease what the private sector spends on goods and services. And that's simply wrong, right? Simply because when the private sector's income goes down, it doesn't have to cut its spending if it's willing to hold fewer financial assets instead. And indeed, the whole reason that increased government spending is supposed to work is that it makes people more comfortable holding the financial assets that they have, and so makes them less anxious to cut back on their spending on currently produced goods and services in order to build up their stocks of financial assets. Myron Scholes, a Stanford finance professor, a Nobel Prize winner, also criticizing Bernanke on the idea that for the Federal Reserve to buy bonds, risky bonds, and hold them in its portfolio for cash can't affect interest rates because the Federal Reserve buys bonds. Those bonds are then the property of the Federal Reserve. The risk is then borne by the Federal Reserve, but who bears the risk that the Federal Reserve will go bankrupt? Rather, it's the taxpayers. The same risk existed now. It exists that existed then. It can't have any effect on asset prices. That seems to me to be simply wrong because taxpayers are a very different group of people than investors. Investors are rich and old. Taxpayers are middle class and much younger. Shift a whole bunch of risk off of investors who are already bearing too much risk, much more risk than they want to, as shown by the high risky real interest rates in the economy, shifted onto taxpayers. It's quite plausible that will change the risk premium. And indeed, economists at the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco and elsewhere who have been estimating the effects of the Federal Reserve's quantitative easing programs have been finding that it's been reducing interest rates by on the order of 0.5 percentage point or so. And yet, all 7 of these lines of argument seem to me to be absolutely, completely, and obviously fallacious. There's simply not enough unemployed construction workers to account for the recession. There's no sign of the high vacancies you have in a high structural unemployment economy. The overaccumulation of capital simply doesn't work once you look at this graph and see that the overbuilding triangle is less than the post-crisis depressed underbuilding trapezoid. For uncertainty, if you people who are worried about overregulation and high future taxes should be worried about overregulation and high future taxes rather than being worried about poor sales and interest rates. The need to control inflation in order to avoid a double dip as people get scared of inflation requires that people actually be scared of inflation, which means that asset market signals of what expected inflation is should be showing that it's going up. And for Lucas, Fama, and Scholes, as you say, if you don't know why banks and financial assets are relatively special, and that an excess demand for financial assets produces a deficient demand for goods and services, if you don't know something that the rest of the economics profession has had straight for 180 years, why are you up there talking? Similarly, if you haven't thought that investors are a different group than taxpayers, and when you shift the burden of bearing risk off of overburdened investors onto taxpayers, you may well affect the risk premium. You kind of haven't even started thinking through the issues. And this is what I blame on Milton Friedman. His libertarian idea that you want to establish property rights, establish courts, and otherwise get out of the way, that Friedman's recognition that that really wasn't sufficient, that the uneven depression history of the world since 1825 said you have to do something else, and Friedman said the right something else is keep the money stock growing smoothly. If you do that, you don't have to worry about either high inflation or mass unemployment. And then the corollary, once you've signed up for my semi-libertarian agenda, you don't have to pay any attention to what these other economists have been doing. That the consequence is an awful lot of economists coming out of the Friedman tradition who don't know anything about depression economics macro because they never studied it. And here Paul Krugman thinks I'm actually being a little too mean to Uncle Milton. That is that the current people are 2 or 3 generations beyond Milton Friedman in terms of intellectual influence. And that although he started the ball rolling, it could have been deflected at lots of points before here. And so we have a bunch of people who haven't thought issues through, and yet are compelled because they're talkative, because they're libertarian and think government intervention has to always be wrong, or because they're playing on Team Republican, and Team Republican demands their obedience, that they've got to opine on these questions and come up with some theory of why we're in a big recession, which isn't the monetarist theory, which doesn't work, and also isn't the Keynesian theory, which they know is wrong because Milton Friedman told them so. And that, I think, is the intellectual process that generates the people who say that banking and fiscal policy must be ineffective as stimulative measures, that generates the view that you can do it all through monetary policy alone, that generates the view of those who say we really have to control inflation, that generates those who say it's because of uncertainty, because of overaccumulation, because of structural unemployment, or because of the existence of low marginal product workers. And that's where I want to conclude our depression economics section, and say, at least I hope that you all will hold firmly to the idea that we could get out of our current high unemployment dilemma, that we could push our unemployment rate down from 9% to 6% relatively quickly and relatively smoothly, if only we had the political will to undertake the stimulative fiscal and monetary policies to do so. And that next time we're going to start on situations in which you do need to control inflation. The economy of the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s, because situations in which an economy faces an inflation problem, well, we had them in the past, and they may well come back again in the future. And let me stop there.